All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to moderate Ashoka's second summer series session. Today's session is titled Fighting Global Segregation and Abuse, an International Human Rights Movement. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Isabel Martin. I am a legal intern working for the Global Integrity team at Ashoka, and I'm also a rising 2L at New York Law School. Joining us today are our panelists, a few of my fellow interns who are part of the Social Entrepreneurs and Legal Transformation program called CELT, as well as Anna and Anna, two of Ashoka's esteemed fellows. All of the students, including myself, have a desire to be vehicles for positive change. CELT's mission is to provide Ashoka's interns the opportunity to become change makers, using our unique skills and passion to change the world through innovation and the law. Many of the interns' interests include data privacy and compliance, environmental law, international law, and human rights law. Now, if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and I will call on you to unmute yourselves. And I'm going to go ahead and get started and introduce Ashoka's Fellow and Executive Director of Disability Rights International, Eric Rosenthal. Thank you so much, Eric, for being here today. And can you please introduce yourself and begin enlightening us on your journey representing human rights and disability rights?
Okay, let's see again, not muted. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am, as you mentioned, the founder and director of Disability Rights International. It's an international human rights organization dedicated to protecting the rights of children and adults with disabilities. My background is out of the disability rights movement in the United States. I had worked for a group based in Washington, D.C. doing civil rights for people with mental disabilities called the Mental Health Law Project that brought test cases to U.S. courts working on deinstitutionalization and fighting for the rights of people detained in American psychiatric hospitals. When I went to law school, and now I'm dating myself here, in the early 1990s, the Berlin Wall fell during my first year of law school. The world was changing. So I had a background in this area of mental health and human rights, and I took an international human rights class. And I remember my teacher at the time, who was a Professor Juan Mendez, who went on to be the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, a member of the Inter-American Commission. He himself had been a political prisoner in Argentina in the Dirty War in the 1970s. He said, Eric, your background is in mental health. It would be great if you would do a paper for this course on international human rights and mental health. What does international human rights law have to say about the rights of people in mental health facilities? I went and I did research. And in the early 1990s, amazingly enough, there was essentially nothing. There was almost no international law. There was almost no international practice. Groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International had not spoken out about these issues. I found when I did research that there were reports by groups like the State Department and the World Psychiatric Association about abuses in Soviet psychiatric hospitals, where political dissidents had been locked up in psychiatric hospitals as a way of squelching their dissent. People who spoke out against the Soviet Union were labeled as mentally ill and placed in psychiatric facilities. I read these reports, and it was an eerie experience because the description of the psychiatric facilities were very much like the large psychiatric facilities of yesteryear in the United States that had been closed down. 1,000-bed facilities where people were locked up with little due process in rooms where they could, not move around, where they essentially were there for the rest of their lives. And these were exactly the things that the civil rights movement, the disability rights movement, had been trying to end in the United States. And yet it was interesting. When I saw these reports, they said, well, these people may actually have been mentally ill. And so, the human rights reports at the time would pick out one political dissident in a 1,000-bed facility and say, isn't it terrible that this dissident is locked up in this psychiatric facility with all these mentally ill people, as if it was like almost part of the punishment is that they have to associate and be next to mentally ill people. And they're given these horrible psychotropic drugs that dull their mind and cause nerve damage. And they were locked up without due process and freedom. And they never see the light of day and can't go outside. And all of these abuses, the 1,000 other people in the facility were experiencing, but to these groups, it was the dissident whose rights were abused, but not everyone else. There was an Amnesty International report that I saw about Romania, where they were using a treatment that they called unmodified ECT, electroconvulsive therapy without anesthesia. Now, I don't know if you know, but in American mental health facilities, and this was highly controversial in the 1970s and is still used but controversial today, there is a practice called ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, where they can give you put little paddles on your brain and give you a shock and a seizure. And it's actually an accepted practice in the United States for the treatment of depression. Activists don't like it. People with disabilities don't like it because it can cause amnesia. There are many defenders of it, but in the United States and in many countries of the world, it's used with anesthesia. In Romania, it was being used without anesthesia. So a person who was shocked felt the electricity coursing through their body. And Amnesty International looked at this and said, well, the doctors who are doing this are not like those Soviet physicians. They don't mean to be using it as a form of political repression. They're trying to treat the patient. They have good intent, and therefore it may raise ethical issues that it causes extreme pain, but it's not a human rights violation. Amazingly enough, Amnesty International said this. You have a person in detention who's locked up, tied down, and being subjected to electric shock, but because they're mentally ill and the doctor means well, being shocked is somehow not torture. So I wrote this report. I wrote a law review article while I was in law school about what was going on. Why was the international movement failing people with disabilities? Why was it not arbitrary detention to lock up a person in an institution? Why was it not torture to give someone unmodified ECT just because the doctor meant well? Why was the international human rights movement overlooking this issue entirely? It was an incredible opportunity. I never intended to go into this as a career, but I had stumbled across a major gap in international practice. I ended up, after law school, applying for something called an Echoing Green, and I got an Echoing Green fellowship to set up a new organization to work on this. It was then called Mental Disability Rights International. We've since expanded to call it Disability Rights International. In all honesty, I thought that what I was going to do is spend a couple of years on this project, go in, like Amnesty International do a human rights report, and instead of writing about the one person who was a dissident, write about the 1,000 people who were locked up in these facilities. And I thought, once I wrote a couple of these reports, the human rights community would pick up on this, and then I could go on my merry way and have my real career. And this would become part of the human rights spectrum. I was amazingly wrong. There was an enormous amount of resistance to this. I founded the organization in the early 1990s, and our work was very much overlooked, criticized by many who felt that we were criticizing well-meaning reformers and undermining the activists by taking an adversarial approach, that writing human rights reports where reform was needed was overly adversarial. After about 10 years of doing this work, in which we made some major breakthroughs, the New York Times Magazine covered our work in the year 2000 when we reported about horrendous abuses in Mexican psychiatric facilities. The Mexican government responded by initiating a process through the United Nations to draft a new international convention on the rights of people with disabilities. And for me, it was a dream come true. The sad fact is that in Mexico, they didn't do a damn thing. We had exposed incredible abuses. It's a lot easier to go to the UN and draft a treaty than to fix your own problems. So they went to the UN, they drafted a treaty, and the world has really been transformed by the UN Disability Treaty. I'm going to show you a little video that we did early in my career. And, just to give you some perspective, you'll see I have a lot more hair in the video. It was made about 20 years ago. Early on, when we were still trying to achieve recognition of disability rights as fundamental human rights. The field has changed enormously. It's hard to understand quite how horrendous this is till you go inside a psychiatric hospital, an orphanage, and other institution and see it for yourself. These are shocking videos, so let me warn you, but it's important for you to see it. I'd love to take your questions after it. There are new challenges 20, 30 years later. What are the role of donors? How is it that international donors who mean well have actually made the problem worse in many ways? What have been the role of people with disabilities in controlling this movement? Those are questions that I'm hoping we'll have a chance to discuss afterwards, but let's start by taking a look at this video.
I've seen children sticking their fingers in their eye, scratching themselves. You can see bloody tracks where they've scratched their skin raw. And that is because they just have no stimulation, and any form of feeling becomes better than the nothingness that's the institution.
This video reveals the human rights abuses that go unchecked in psychiatric institutions, orphanages, and mental retardation facilities around the world. Eric Rosenthal, the director of Mental Disability Rights International, or MDRI, has conducted investigations in Mexico, Uruguay, Armenia, Russia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Hungary, and the former Yugoslavia. He sees recurring problems of cruel and degrading treatment, inadequate attention, and inappropriate institutionalization.
The truth is, most institutions around the world have more similarities than differences. So what we captured in Mexico was not that much different from what I saw in Romania, Hungary, Russia, Ukraine. Rows of beds, totally sterile, these places where people live for the rest of their life and absolutely no sense of individuality whatsoever. One of the hardest things to communicate in a written report is the abuse of locking up a person in a sterile room and having them sit there, do nothing.
Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights states that no one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment.
What does that mean in the context of a person with a psychiatric disability? It means being locked up in a cage. It means being locked up to rot in your own filth. It means being totally lacking in any form of privacy or dignity.
In many of the institutions that MDRI visits, there is no privacy. Every room is communal. The clothes are shared, the bathrooms are filthy, puddles of urine dot the floors, and the conditions are utterly dehumanizing.
Five cups. There are 5 cups for 99 patients.
99 patients, including some of the women who had urinated over here and had not had a chance to go to the bathroom. Some of them walking in it, sitting in it.
Most of these institutions are severely understaffed and overflowing with people. Medical attention is often inappropriate or hopelessly inadequate. A shockingly common problem is self-abuse. Children and adults, starved of stimulation, hurt themselves to feel something, anything. So staff respond by tying them down for hours on end. In one institution in Mexico, MDRI investigators came across a child strapped down in a wheelchair with sheets wrapped around his body.
No, they're tying it under, they're putting the restraints under the mattress there, so we can't.
Second restraints off the child.
Right.
Put it on the mattress.
Staff do not have time to tend to people or to give them the care they need.
This man has been running up and down this hall for the last half an hour naked. No one seems to be taking any notice of him.
At stake is not just a patient's immediate welfare, but their long-term condition. For young children, starving them of attention will have lifelong consequences.
This little kid is so needed human contact. Just the littlest contact he responds to. And he's just got so much energy and just walking around.
Activists like Eric Rosenthal see community integration as the answer to many of these problems. For legal precedent, he turns to the 1991 UN Principles for the Protection of Persons with Mental Illness, which state that every person with mental illness shall have the right to live and work to the extent possible in the community. Authorities admit that people are detained in institutions because they have nowhere else to go. Once they are admitted, it is often hard for patients to leave, whether they are fit to or not. Legal mechanisms to protect against arbitrary detention do not exist, or there may be nowhere and no one to release them to. According to the director at one Mexican institution, 80% of the people detained did not need to be there. Faced with tremendous stigma and discrimination and no supportive care in the community, the burden of caring for people with mental disabilities is often left to the family. When they cannot cope and feel they have no choice but to place a relative in an institution, they are often blamed by medical authorities. In Mexico, people placed in institutions by family members are called abandonados. In this unit, there were 15 abandonados.
Of the 15, 12 have been conditioned to be discharged for 4 years, and the rest have been in condition for 6 months.
I see. And, is it difficult to find their families?
Sí, sí, es muy difícil encontrar sus familias.
It's difficult, as the families are clever and normally don't need the real address when they bring them for admission. And then the emotional bonds weaken over time. The close family members, like parents and siblings, start disappearing, and only more distant relatives remain, who definitely don't want to take responsibility for the patients.
In countries of the former Soviet Union, family members have reported to MDRI that doctors told them to give up a disabled child immediately after birth so they would not become too attached to the baby. Many families are heartbroken by the pressure to give up their child and would do anything to keep them at home.
These are children that are waiting for a placement. The family takes them to different psychiatrists, specialists to see if there's any hope they can do anything with them within their homes. And then they are recommended to be taken to different institutions. And the second level is that socially they're not able to have a specialist come to their homes to take care of them. That's why they bring the children to our institutions.
In addition to documenting abuses, MDRI works closely with activists who are working to challenge discrimination and reform laws in their own countries.
I think that's really.
Gabor Gambos is a Hungarian physicist who founded the Voice of Soul, an advocacy organization made up of psychiatric survivors.
Then we feel that we are not alone. We can share knowledge and expertise, techniques, how we can influence legislation, how we can improve human rights conditions.
MDRI is fighting for the day when mental disability rights are an accepted part of the international human rights agenda. One significant step in the right direction was taken in March 2000 when MDRI presented the findings of its report on abuses in Mexico's psychiatric facilities to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. As a consequence, for the first time ever, the next annual report of the Commission on Mexico's Human Rights Record raises concerns about conditions in psychiatric facilities there. Shortly after these public hearings, Mexico declared that it would close one of the most abusive institutions. For mental disability activists, it's another step on the road to widespread recognition of some long ignored basic human rights. For further information on what you can do to help the cause of people in institutions around the world, contact MDRI.
Well, it's a difficult video to watch, and 20 years old, and yet I have to say the abuses that we've seen in those facilities are very much what goes on in the world today. There are 10 million children in institutions around the world, and no one has even begun to count the number of adults. It's probably 5, 6, 7 times that many. I mean, to my mind, it is one of the great human rights violations of the world today that 60, 70 million people's lives have been thrown away by being locked up in places like this. I can go into the immediate challenges that we're facing today, but maybe it would take a valuable moment to kind of pause for questions about the video, your questions about the field in general. Why don't we open it up to questions now, and then I can add some of the more recent situations afterwards.
I think that sounds great. I'll go ahead and start with the first question. That video was really moving. I definitely was most impacted by the fact that they said that 80% of the patients who were in that facility didn't need to be there. And I would like for you to elaborate on if they didn't need to be in those facilities, but they weren't going to be accepted by their families who didn't want them anymore.
Right.
Where do they go? What would be the place for them to be that it would be a better condition to where they are now, being able to actually participate somewhat in the community, in their community? Where would they go?
It's a great question. And, it's interesting when you see a video that you made 20 years ago, I'm sitting there wincing at the things that I said 20 years ago that I would never say today. I mean, there are things in there, it's like, oh my God, can I really show this video? Like, for example, they use the word mental retardation. It's like, it's an affront, it's an epithet. I'm not, I think, can I really show this video at all? Because these are terms that are so outdated. The 80% do not need to be there suggests that 20% do need to be there. And under the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, every person, 100% of people with disabilities, have a right to live in the community. So it's kind of the old way of thinking to say, oh, well, they're not really so mentally ill, they might be able to live in the community, or they're not so intellectually disabled. The reality is that today we believe, and as a fundamental right, that all people should be in the community, children should be in families. And of course, now to your question, how do you do that? There are ways in which supports can be given to help families raise their children at home, no matter what their disability. A person who has been diagnosed with mental illness, the truth is, treatment and support for mental illness does not require anyone to be locked up. Mm-hmm. There are models for emergency support. You're having a psychotic breakdown and hallucinations and delusions. Do you have to be treated in a locked environment? Can you be treated in your own home? Mm-hmm. Can you be treated in a place where you have people around you 24 hours who will support and watch you and care for you and look out for you? Absolutely, that's necessary in the most acute conditions, but we no longer, at least in the advocacy community, accept today that forced treatment or detention are ever required. Locking up a person is bad for them. It's traumatic, it's a violation of their rights, and we find that basically the emotional trauma of being locked up is more dangerous than any form of treatment or help that can be gained from being locked up. And so now we believe that with support, all people with disabilities can live in the community.
Thank you so much for answering my question. I think, Anu, I will start with you and your question, and then we'll go to Anna and then Hannah.
I was wondering if you can comment on it. How were you able to find out about the institutions in different countries, and how were you able to gain access to them? Because like the videos, it was so like shocking and like shameful that it seems like just being there and being able to share what's going on and like tie it to human rights framework was in and of itself such effective advocacy that it's almost surprising that you were able to go there and do that. So I was just wondering how that happened.
Yep, it's a good question. You know what I'm thinking is that since we have 3 hands up, why don't I take all 3 questions and then I'll try to respond to all of them at the same time? Because those are really good questions. Why don't we hear the other 2 questions first?
Okay, I can add my question. So you had mentioned that at the time there had been this New York Times article and they had addressed the issues in Mexico in the video, and you had said that then instead of addressing them at home, Mexico went to the UN to draft this new convention. I know that laid the groundwork for the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006. And so I'm wondering if Mexico went to the UN to sort of avoid legal reform at home, what implications does this international UN convention have in terms of addressing legal issues and these violations in countries that are part of the UN?
Excellent, excellent. Glad to respond to that. Mexico is the country that has broken my heart. The challenges are so enormous there, but yes, I'd like to talk to you about Mexico. And the third question?
Hi, yeah. So mine is more focused on the families. I'm just curious in your work, your advocacy work throughout the years, what types of encounters you have with the families, if any, and what they kind of say about the situation with their loved one that has been institutionalized. And I guess sort of there are certain cultures where I'm sure that there's a higher level of stigma around mental illness, and the families that are from those cultures, I'm curious as to how the choice to institutionalize them played a part, or how the stigma played a part into that, and if what they're facing as far as maybe they don't want their communities to know that they have a loved one institutionalized, things like that. I'm just very curious about your experience with the families themselves.
Yep, excellent. All right, well, the 3 questions come from completely 3 different angles, and so let me address each of them. The first one on access. The reality is, you can, I often say it this way, throw a dart at a map of the world, and wherever you go, you will find horrendous abuses against people with disabilities, particularly those locked up in institutions. The psychiatric facilities is probably the most universal problem. Orphanages are the challenge that we're working on. Some countries have them, some, like the United States, have abolished them. Interestingly enough, in countries where rights are not recognized, that's where it's easiest to get access, because people have no idea they're doing anything wrong or that there's anything to hide. Early in my career, we went to Hungary, where we found, I remember it was December, I walked into a room, it was 4 p.m., the lights were turned off because it was getting dark. The nurse switched on the light, and there's a room of people locked in cages. And the nurse says, oh, here are the behavior problems. These are not human beings. These are the behavior problems. But we had to lock up in these cages for their own safety because they are hard to control. She flicked on the lights and then she flicked them off. In the United States, they actually have some pretty horrible abuses close to that. They'd never let us in for a minute. We have all kinds of rights recognized, and with HIPAA laws and privacy and all those issues, the chances of me going in and pulling out a video camera and taking video, I can only do it in countries where they basically don't protect rights at all. I personally am highly skeptical of places like the United States and other countries that say, sorry, you can't take video because we're protecting the privacy of the patient. I don't believe for 1 minute they're protecting the privacy of the patient. They're protecting their own liability so that we can't document the abuses. So we have actually been tremendously successful just by knock, knock, knock on the door. I'm an American, I'd like to come in. Sadly, in developing countries, they assume if you're American, you're a donor who might be giving some money. So they come on in hoping that you'll donate money to them. The more successful we are at our work, the more difficult it is to get access. So in Mexico and many other countries where we've been working for many years, it used to be very easy. We write reports and it's getting harder and harder and harder and harder to get access. So we have no right to access, we just ask. And we've been able to do that around the world. So far, so good, though it is definitely getting harder. Mexico in specific, after our report was released, as I said, the New York Times Magazine covered this in January 2000. We had a 15-page spread in the New York Times Magazine. ABC News went down to Mexico with its cameras, put a camera in the face of the Minister of Health and said, look at these abuses that are going on. What are you going to do about it? The Minister of the Health said at the time, I will fix this in 6 months, having no clue what a challenge that was. They actually hired the psychiatrist who we had on our team to go down and they said, how can you fix this in 6 months? And he said, well, the one institution, I mean, there are hundreds of institutions in Mexico. We were able to close one institution in 6 months, which shows that it can be done. But sadly, and this is one of the big problems that we find around the world, easy to close a big, horrible, abusive facility, but what did they create? Community services, good community services, take a while to create. And they did all of the wrong things. What they did, this psychiatric facility was out in the middle of nowhere. They leveled the psychiatric facility and they built nice, pretty little houses on the grounds of the psychiatric facility. So people were now living in pretty little houses, but they were in a remote area, not connected to society, and this became the new institution. And that's one of the big challenges that we're facing, going from big institutions to small institutions. It doesn't even have to look like an institution, but it can perpetuate segregation from society in all kinds of new ways. I've been working, we have a staff in Mexico, we've been working there for 20 years now. And of all the countries that I've worked in, Mexico has been the most resistant to change. We have released report after report and gotten incredible worldwide publicity, and very, very little has changed in Mexico. I went back to Juan Mendez, who was my professor 20 years ago. He's now on my board of directors. He was a member of the Secretary General's Special Envoy on Transitional Justice and Genocide. And we talked to him about what it means after 20 years. The government knows what it's doing and yet continues policies that lock people up, subject to them to torture on a mass scale, subject to them to experiences that are going to cause death. And we said, could we call this crimes against humanity? And Juan Mendez said, yes. In his opinion, when you are knowingly, the difference between a crime and other human rights, you have to do it intentionally. You have to knowingly put people's lives at risk. And Mexico is doing that. And our first report on Mexico that said it was a crime against humanity was for a country that knew it was putting people's lives at risk. So far, we have yet to get the criminal prosecution, but we're working through the United Nations now to call for a truth commission. We believe that in the end, to bring about change in countries like Mexico where there's no accountability, criminal action is going to be necessary. Lastly, the question about family. I have great sympathy. It's very easy to blame families for dumping children in institutions, for giving up families as if they don't care. I know families care tremendously Most families would keep their children at home or their relatives. They lack support. They should not be expected to take on the burden. It's a burden of society to make sure that society is accessible. And the Disability Convention requires that we make society fully supportive and accessible for all people, and it is not the family's responsibility. Although obviously, to the extent that family can be supported to do their role, they need to be. There is the question of stigma and culture. What about if families really believe it's the right thing? That we could talk about for the next few hours. I teach a course in this, and we really do go into it in depth in terms of the culture and the universal standards. To my mind, this is one of those areas where this is what human rights law is all about. Just because you think in your culture that it's okay to lock people up doesn't mean that from the point of view of human rights law, it is. If you've got prejudice and stigma, human rights law's job is to say, nope, this is a human rights violation, not okay. In Kenya, we did research with families. The majority, not the minority, the majority of families who had children born with disabilities in Kenya were told to kill their child because it is considered a shame and an evil curse to have a child with a disability. So in that culture, killing children with disabilities is a good idea, and families are pressured to do so. And yet, what do the families do? Yes, there is infanticide on a large scale. Many families fight back against that culture. Those people need to be supported. I do not buy into the idea that we have to respect the local culture when it means sacrificing the individual like that. The cultural aspect of how you do that, how you do it in a way that is culturally sensitive and supportive in that society, well, that's the challenge to everything. That's why disability control is so important, why local control to create inclusive communities and societies, the people in the society have to be in charge. As an American, I can't tell you how to do it. But as a citizen of the world, I can say, we can't write off people because they have a disability. It is not okay to kill children because they have a disability.
Wow, that was just really impactful to hear. I know a lot of us here are very passionate about human rights as a whole, and most of us here are rising. We're law students, and some of us have realized what we want to focus on, and some of us are still trying to figure that out. I would really like to get to know when you realized that this is what you wanted to do in your life. You might have been passionate about other things that you were focusing on, but what about disability rights really was the path that you decided you wanted to follow?
It's interesting because most people who do this work have an immediate family or personal connection. When I stumbled into this work, I really kind of did it as a human rights lawyer because no one else was doing it. And I didn't think of it as something that I was personally driven to do it because of a personal or family connection. I've since learned about my family. My grandmother was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. My family was very much wrecked by some experiences that she had. I have had abuse in my family. I have had a cousin who was subject to ECT and locked up. I've had a cousin who was living in a group home. What is amazing is that this is the fabric of life. We all have it. Everyone has family members who have disabilities, and it probably affects you ways that you never even thought about. And there are all kinds of ways in which I was thinking about this, in part because of my family experiences, but I didn't even know it till I was already involved in this field. I ended up marrying a woman who is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, who as a teenager was labeled with schizophrenia, who was locked in a psychiatric facility here in Massachusetts, and raped in the psychiatric facility, who escaped in her nightgown in the snow without permission, and locked herself in a closet for a week, waiting for the people from the psychiatric hospital to go get her. She was told as a schizophrenic that she would never have a job and have a life or have a family. She got married and had a kid, got a divorce and raised a child as a single mother, went on to be a journalist, an author, and a human rights activist. And I met her as a human rights activist. She also founded a movement called the Psychiatric Recovery Movement, which said that just because you're labeled with schizophrenia and mental illness doesn't mean you can't go on to recover and live a full, good, decent life. So my wife is labeled with mental illness, and she's the sanest, most competent person I know. So yes, it is very much part of my life, but something I stumbled into and discovered afterwards.
It's amazing. Thank you so much, Eric. I think we have a few more questions. I think Erin had her hand up first, and then we'll go to Anna.
Thanks, Isabel. Hi, Mr. Rosenthal. Thank you for coming to talk to us today. I'm curious, you talked about how in countries with lesser protections, like legal protections for patients like HIPAA, you're able to sort of walk into institutions with a camera and just film things. But obviously, that means that the easiest countries to expose are already those whose people are fairly vulnerable because they have available to them fewer of the protections that of their other legal rights that would have made it more difficult for you to get in. So I'm wondering sort of how your tactics change from country to country. As you said, abuse is likely as rampant in the US as it is in countries like Mexico and Hungary, but we just don't know about it because those institutions are just better at keeping it private. So I'm wondering, sort of how you think about your country to country approach and how you, make it clear to the public that it's not just countries where you can walk into the institution that experiences these things, but, all countries perpetrate these abuses on an equal scale, and some are just easier to expose.
Wow. Answering that question is going to take a lot more time because obviously country-specific responses are very important, and it really does depend. We've had a lot of low-hanging fruit to grab, and yet the harder challenges are there in many societies. I will mention that one thing that we didn't expect, which has probably been the greatest threat to our whole business model, if you could call it that, is COVID. Because with COVID, access has suddenly become nearly impossible. In theory, again, for the protection of the detainees, you can't get into most psychiatric facilities or orphanages or group homes. The children in a lot of these group homes are totally socially isolated as a result. So what was created again for their protection, their isolation, as an organization that was built on human rights monitoring and advocacy, how do we do it in a world in which we can't even get into any facilities? Right now we're on total lockdown and can't do that. And we are scratching our heads right now as to how do we do it? We're trying to create technological solutions. We're working on something we call DRI Lifesaver, which is a telephone app which will allow people to record abuses and upload them onto servers safely so that they can record their own human rights violations. But most people in institutions have no access to computer or phones. People with disabilities who are illiterate, how are they supposed to do it? So basic monitoring, this is an enormous challenge that we're going through right now, and quite frankly, have not figured out how to crack this nut. Many other approaches are possible and necessary. Necessity is the mother of invention. We have to figure out new ways to do it. We did a survey, a global survey a year ago where people could go online and report on abuses. We did a global survey of disability under COVID and something called the Disability Rights Monitor. If you go to COVID_DRM, Disability Rights Monitor, we did a worldwide report on discrimination against people with disabilities, which came out with some amazing stories about it at institutions. We would have never thought to do a world report based upon self-reporting before something like this. So we have been able to get new documentation. So these are the challenges that we're facing now. It's really, really hard. And we are still trying to figure out how to solve those problems. One more question I see.
Yes. So this kind of goes back to the last question that Isabel had, and something you said right at the beginning. Since we are all law students are interested in different issues like human rights, you had mentioned that you had written an article during your period of law school that sort of jump-started this. And last week we were speaking with the other fellow, Albert Kahn, who had mentioned, writing op-eds or writing law review or different articles as sort of a way to expose oneself to different potential areas of interest that you might want to pursue as a career. If you're going into public interest or human rights work as a lawyer. And so I was wondering if there are any other things that sort of inspired you to pursue disability rights after law school, in addition to writing this article and doing this research, as well as you had mentioned the resistance that you faced from Amnesty Rights International. And so what it was like sort of going into this field as a lawyer, facing this resistance from other like large international advocate groups.
Well, one thing that I would encourage lawyers not to do, and I think that there's a certain, in law school, you want to hone your legal skills, right? You want to be the best damn lawyer you can be. And there are skills, legal advocacy skills that you want to learn. The law you want to learn. And writing that law review article was really valuable for me in terms of making me the expert in this area of law that I wanted to do. So by all means, your legal training is important. But I would also encourage you, and I've seen many law students make this mistake, think that their only skill in life is law. And in the advocacy world, there are many, many skills that go beyond law that you have to be willing to be creative and learn and step out of your lawyer role sometimes in order to do. For me, it was learning how to use a video camera. All the law review articles in the world were not going to bring world attention to this issue. And even in our first reports that we wrote without videos, when I walked into that room in Hungary where it was a room full of people locked in cages, that was before I had a video camera. This was in the early 1990s. Video cameras were big and clunky, and I didn't know how to use one. You can write about that, but no one really responded to 23 people locked in a cage until you got the photo and the video. And then suddenly, oh my God, there's so much more you could communicate with photo and video. And so learning to use video advocacy, learning to go to the media, work in the media, working the news. In some ways, I'm a dinosaur in the field because I got my start figuring out how to use video to go to television and getting on television. Getting on in the New York Times Magazine and ABC News transformed the field 20 years ago. My big challenge, and if there are any interns out there or people who want to help us volunteer to figure out the next challenge of the 21st century, how do we get beyond in a world in which no one reads the New York Times or watches television? And I haven't quite figured out how we change people's minds and influence people. Social media, I have not figured out. Influencers, I have not figured out. What people read, I don't know anymore. And so those are kinds of things that you have to be able to figure out. Organizational skills. I'm an executive director of an organization. The truth is I spent half of my life fundraising. I hate fundraising. I didn't go to law school to fundraise. I want to do advocacy. But to run an organization, you have to know how to fundraise. Fundraising skills are important. Strategic planning skills are important. There are many, many other skills. So you have to be willing to get beyond your comfort zone and even your pleasure zone and do some shitty work that you don't like. But it justifies doing the stuff that you really love and you really care about. And so that's my major piece of advice. Finding a way to pull it all together is the greatest pleasure there is, and being able to have an impact.
Thank you, Eric. Anil, would you like to ask another question?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could comment on the relationship between the work that you do and criminal justice reform, because I know in my city, at least, and probably a lot of cities, the jail is the biggest provider of mental health care, which is problematic for a lot of reasons. And I was wondering, like, as someone who might go into criminal law, what do you think is the best way within that system to advocate for people with mental disabilities?
You know, in the 1980s, before I went to law school, I worked for a group then called the Mental Health Law Project that was pushing to close down psychiatric facilities. There were homeless people in the street. Deinstitutionalization was very frightening. People didn't like it. They accused us disability activists of causing homelessness. Because of the unpopularity, the stigma against people with disabilities, the fear of including people with disabilities, the organization I worked for in the 1980s made a strategic decision to stay out of the criminal law area because people who were in the criminal justice system were already so stigmatized that we were going to deal with the nice, wholesome, non-criminal population of people with disabilities to argue that they could be integrated into the community. It was a tactical decision that they made at the time, which maybe was a good decision and maybe it was a bad decision, but it is one that I have followed for many years, which is we are fighting so hard to get kids out of orphanages who just need to be accepted into society that we have avoided the more controversial issues. And that's honestly a real problem. And you are absolutely right that in the United States, the largest psychiatric detention center is the Los Angeles City Jail. More mentally ill people are locked up in the Los Angeles jail than in any psychiatric facility. So maybe that tactical decision was the right thing then and the wrong thing now, because we have to figure out how to work the criminal justice system. So I, in my career, have never been an expert in those issues. I can tell you that in my international work, what I have seen is the following. I've visited countless orphanages and psychiatric facilities, and I visited a small number of prisons and jails. For the most part, and I'm talking outside of the US, I can't speak to the US, the psychiatric facilities have been the worst hellholes I have ever seen. The jails, pretty bad. The prisons, better. Horrible as jails and prisons are, the worst thing you can ever end up in is a psychiatric facility. When you're sentenced to prison, usually there's an end to your sentence. Those people who are declared mentally ill and locked in Spanish, inimputable, people they can't even go to trial because they are not competent to stand trial and stuck in indefinite detention, are in the worst. So there have to be solutions, obviously, but in some ways the criminal justice system can be more forgiving than psychiatric systems. Looking at the overlay is very, very important. And I strongly encourage you to do it. And maybe you can teach me something about how to do it better when you figure it out.
Thank you, Eric. Well, we only have a few minutes left. So if anyone else has any questions that they would like to ask Eric, please ask them now. But I definitely have many questions that I wish we had another hour for. But I did want to tell you that I'm very thankful that you were so open and honest about your personal reasons for why you went into this field. And I personally, my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, I think about 6 or 7 years ago, and she still is struggling. And I couldn't get over just how me as one person in the United States, I have a grandmother who is struggling and needs full-time care all day, every single day. And watching that video today was really impactful, seeing all of those adults, elderly people, children who are in countries that have no resources, just how much they're struggling. And it was really eye-opening for me to know just how many people in the world are struggling. And it made me realize that probably almost every single person on the Zoom in our community have someone that has a disability that needs care for. And so I just wanted to say thank you for being open and telling your story, because it's touching to know that every single person in here is not alone who has someone close to them who has had their struggles.
There's
So
an adage in the disability field that we are all at most temporarily abled. Disability is something, we've kind of discrete and insular minorities in constitutional law. This is one of those communities that you can join any minute. You're crossing the street and you get hit by a car and you're a person with a disability for the rest of your life.
Right.
You can almost expect that you will be a person with a disability eventually. And again, the people around you. So it is part of life. It's not us and them, it's everyone and everywhere. And that's a really important perspective to have. So thank you for that comment.
thank you. I would like to ask you, I think that we kind of touched on this before, but many of us, like I said, we have very specific paths that we probably want to go down, but what piece of advice could you give us as human rights activists? What I think if you could just hone in on one specific mindset or goal that you were able to follow that you think really helped you in your career that we could follow ourselves to be real change makers?
Hard to get it down to one, but what I've seen among my friends and colleagues is kind of the persistence of making sure it happens. I mean, there are so many barriers to making it in your public interest field. Opportunities tend to be limited, and doors open up in ways that you never imagined for those who are persistent. When I went into law school, my goal was to do international. I had lived in the West Bank and Gaza. I wanted to get back to Gaza and work on the rights of Palestinians. And that opportunity never materialized because I stumbled across this field that no one else was doing. And I felt, oh my God, I've got to do this. So persisting and finding those areas and niches where you're needed and where you can make a contribution. And I've generally found that those people who do persist and are really committed find some way to make a difference one way or the other. Even when all the doors seem closed, there is a way to make a difference. And so I'm really encouraging you to dedicate yourself to it. And it's great to see you do it.
Thank you so much. I think we all really appreciate the time that you took to speak with us today. I think this was definitely probably one of the most moving series of speaker events that I've been to. So I just wanted to say thank you so much, and thank you on behalf of
welcome you all to be in touch if anyone's interested in further work in this field, or your substantive work happens to overlay it. Feel free to reach out. Disability Rights International. We're on the web. I'd love to be in touch.
Thank you so much, Eric.
Bye.
Thank you.